You're watching BizPulse only on Africa News Network, First Fast Live with me, Cindy Mabi. Good evening to you. South Africa has enjoyed both trade and diplomatic benefits on national and international levels since the alignment with BRICS 10 years ago. However, more needs to be done, and this is according to South African Ambassador to BRICS, Anil Suklak, to deal with issues such as unemployment, poverty and inequality. The 10th BRICS Summit will be held in Johannesburg in July. In advancement of South Africa's national interests, the African Union agenda, deepening South-to-South relations and growing of geopolitical interests will top the agenda. And how does a new ANC leadership affect these agenda, and what changes are going to be witnessed in the BRICS 2018 session is something that we're talking about tonight. And we discuss this with Wesley Seal, a political analyst via Skype, and Zamo Madlala, Radical Economic Transformation on Coalition General Secretary. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll start with you, Wesley. In terms of breaking it down, what each country will contribute to the South African landscape and how we are then able to deal with our unique situation.
Well, I think that it is important, and a good evening to you. It's important to remember that the BRICS countries are quite different from each other. And in this sense, I think that the diversity contributes to a number of factors, not only politically, but also through the economy. And so, yes, in the past 6 years, we've been working very hard to ensure that we have a great and strong alliance with our BRICS partners, getting that diversity, working up our own economy, ensuring that trade agreements are signed, and also ensuring that there is empowerment deals that is beneficial to all the partners.
And what do you say to the monopoly that China enjoys generally in many nations, that this could be another economic colonialism of sorts, if you like?
Well, I think that what is important is that we know that the Chinese are always criticized for their principle of non-interference. And China takes this principle extremely seriously. And non-interference simply means that they are not going to interfere in the domestic affairs of each country. This gains countries their independence. And so it's not only for BRICS countries, but certainly for countries the world over. China is extremely influential throughout the globe, not only in BRICS. And certainly they are ensuring that yes, they are going to put the Chinese footprint across the globe. But I think that we have to ensure that we go into partnerships with China knowing exactly what we want. I think we see this and we learn this from our other BRICS counterparts. They go into negotiations, they deal with China knowing exactly what they want. And China is a different partner. China is not a colonial power. They suffered under colonialism themselves, and so they know what it's like to be occupied. They know what it's like to be a colony. And so therefore, I don't think that they're going to do the same to other countries, and especially, as I say, based on their principle of non-interference, which has been coming on as long as the People's Republic exists, that they will not necessarily interfere with the domestic affairs. That can't be said of other colonial countries, especially as we've seen in West Africa, where the former colonial power continues to interfere in the domestic affairs of those countries.
Well, stay with us. We have Zamo Madlala in studio. You can't ignore, though, where you find in parts of Africa where a lot of the national assets have been shed off to the benefit of the Chinese market or to bolster their resources as well, that the concern needs to be clearly defined in what it is that South Africa and the continent at large is looking to benefit from this block.
Good evening, Cindy, and good evening to the viewers at home. Well, the main thing is that when we look at how China has carried itself throughout the years, especially in comparison, let's say, for instance, with the United States, they have not gone in militarily, meaning that they've saved themselves a lot of money, because all of these wars cost an arm and a leg, and they cost the fiscus. So the Chinese prefer to invest. It's just that in terms of how they tend to do their deals, they always take the China first principle. I mean, if you look at an example, for instance, even Boeing itself, because they got orders of more than 1,000 planes from China, they've had to go and build a plant in China, which will be majority owned by the Chinese. That is their strategy. I think what is very important is that we as a country must be clear in terms of what do we want. When we say we want to develop our our economy, have an inclusive economy. We've been talking past each other. There's been too many things. There's a New Deal, there's been radical economic transformation that actually hasn't been reduced down to policy to say, this is our direction, this is what we are going to do. We will beneficiate our minerals, for instance. So it's less a worry about China than a worry about what is it that we as a country actually want. When we go and negotiate, what do we put forward? Do we have a strategy that says we want to privatize our state-owned companies? What is really at play? What is the country? And that's really what I think the ANC leadership actually needs to be able to give direction to, so that we know. I mean, since '94, I think it's been clear that you have ANC policies and then you have people deployed in government, and generally they get to government and they do their own thing.
I mean, has the horse bolted, Wesley, in the sense that this whole neoliberalism policy of being more biased, if you like, or leaning towards business than the developmental needs of a country is something that we are capable of preventing any further? In the sense of protectionism, we've seen the Chinese import, in fact, international products making their way onto our shelves and then muzzling the local capacity to manufacture and participate in the distribution chain.
Well, I think that, I mean, what would be important for South Africa is that we need to ensure that we're involving the entire continent. The advantage China, of course, has is that they have a market that is 1 billion people strong, 1.3 billion people strong. So I think that they can order from Boeing a number of planes, and then Boeing would come and simply, because it depends on the great demand of the Chinese market. And so I think that it is also important that South Africa strategically positions itself not only as a South Africa, but as the African continent. That is where the AU becomes important, an instrument, so that we also not only find that cohesion in South Africa, but in the cohesion of what we as a continent want, especially from China.
Yeah, stay with us. I mean, we're talking high-end negotiations here around bulk infrastructure and procurement of aircraft and stuff. But just in terms of the retail space, for example, we know that the textile industry took a huge knock and even still is hemorrhaging because of the competition, you could call it unfair competition, that is coming through our borders and our shorelines. So how then is this going to benefit a vendor, for example, who's on the side of the road making an income just from fresh produce?
Well, the reality of it is that we live in a global world, and whether we like it or not, we need to be able to compete with those products. So if we're producing something at 100 Rand and someone can do it at 10 Rand, the 10 Rand product is going to fly. And that is what has been able to happen. And we have opened up our borders. I mean, you find, for instance, the China cities are all over the show. And then when you look at the pricing and you look at what's comparable to it in terms of the pricing, you wonder, how do these guys manage to produce at such low cost? Well, it's mainly because they've been able to drive their wages down. What we have in this country, we have low-skilled or unskilled labor, which has higher demands than what the actual market can afford. I mean, the fact that we have found ourselves sitting with a minimum wage of 3,500, which I think is a good thing. But then you need to ask yourself that, what sort of market do you have where you have to actually force a minimum wage? Then you've got your historical consideration that we've had apartheid, we've had abuse of labor and all of that. So it could be that, but then it could also just be the reality of we actually do not have the skilled labor that should be earning slightly more because they're doing more complicated jobs. So it goes back to us as a country. What do we want to do with our economy and where do we want to drive it? If we want to continue remaining basic, mining, export raw materials from the mining sector and have some portion of agriculture, then we're not going to go anywhere. We need to industrialize, and we need to do it now.
Okay, and the best, I suppose, group to hang out with would be the BRICS bloc. But in your view, an advancement or an advantage for South Africa, at least, hosting the summit in July, as we wrap up? All right.
I think, again, that it would be important for the ANC as... Can you hear me?
Yeah, very briefly, Wes.
Yes, I think that it's important for the ANC as we prepare to host the BRICS summit that we know exactly as a country, as we've indicated, that we know not only as a country but as a continent what exactly we want from the BRICS groups. And I think that that is important. We need to know exactly what we want. We can't simply still blame China for flooding our markets. No, we need to pull up our socks and we need to rise to the occasion and ensure that we are producing at the level that China is. And we've got the capacity and potential to do just that.
Yeah, so skills transfer, and I suppose, like you're saying, to have that competitive edge, we focus largely on China. Let's just look at the other, Brazil, India, and what they bring to the table that South Africa can emulate, or even the continent for that matter, Zamo.
Okay, well, when I look at it, when you look at all the other economies, all of them roughly have about 1 billion people, which means you've got a local demand. For instance, at some point there was allegations that Brazil was dumping chicken on our markets, and it was true, because it used to be the sort of chicken that they would end up discarding and throwing in the ocean, because to North America they were only selling the white meats, so the leg, and we had a flood of those drumsticks. They were all over the supermarkets, and that's the reality of trade. When you go in trade, I've always believed that we've always taken the worst end of the stick, because we go in not knowing what we want. Now, I agree with Wes that the most important thing is that we must not look at ourselves as South Africa. There's only 55 million of us. Whereas if we are looking at ourselves as a representative of Africa, which means the AU, yes, does come into play, then you've got 1 billion people, you've got all the development that must still take place. We must also, as South African, be developing and looking at the continent as our trading partners, because that's where the growth is going to come from.
And Wesley, how advanced is that particular inter-African trade? We see pockets of excellence in certain parts, using their national resources to export as well. How well coordinated is that African cohesion, if you like, in terms of how we trade with the rest of our BRICS partners?
Yeah, well, the cohesion is not there. I don't think that the cohesion is there. And I think that this, again, is where South Africa needs to step up. We are the representative from the continent, and to a large extent, we remain the most sophisticated economy on the continent. And so this is partly the reason why we were invited into BRICS. And so we have to make sure that this cohesion does exist, that we are able to place emphasis on what is important. For example, South Africa has been emphasizing the importance on infrastructure development on the continent, and I think that this is an opportunity for us not only to develop ourselves on the continent, because you can't take infrastructure away, but what is important also is that these BRICS countries then work with us to ensure that we have proper infrastructure development.
Wesley Seal, political analyst, joining us via Skype. Zamo Madlala, Radical Economic Transformation on Coalition. Thanks indeed for joining us, talking on the upcoming BRICS summit that will be held in South Africa in July. And you at home, of course, we look at other